Okay, I'm going to try the recording tonight without the extra light and see what happens. Okay, why did my screen just go blank? Very not helpful. She's been at it for 15 minutes already. I've been sitting here trying to let her get the energy out of her so I can get this video recorded. Right. Okay, so this is Chapter 7, Mythwork 2. And this is a interesting myth about, it's called the settling of the Manor of Terra. Okay, manor spelled in the terms of the domicile type manor, M-A-N-O-R, not M-A-N-N-E-R. The prompt is, the story suggests that in order for our lives to be properly balanced, there are patterns that must be observed. Using the story as a guide, what basic orientation to life is necessary to cultivate balance? Of course, I wrote the prompt as best as I could. I'm sure they're going to hate it and tell me I screwed something up and missed a whole bunch of stuff, but we shall see what comes of this. Okay. The first thing I would say, according to page 55 and 56, where Fintan was discussing the history of the island of Ireland and those people who dwelt on her, he always shared pleasant things about each people. Meaning, because I don't know if you viewers have read this myth or not. So the beginning of the myth, he's going through. Fintan has been called to find out if he's qualified to give advice first, and then to provide some advice about what to do with Terra, which is a big old hill that's, yeah. So he begins by talking about the people who have settled Ireland. You know, we've talked about some in previous videos, and basically he goes from the time of what he calls the deluge, and he goes through all the people, all of the time frame from that point when Ireland was underwater to when the story was written down, which is when, you know, after the Christians had come to the island. Okay, so that's why I said about each people instead of a different wording there. There was no judgment, and he seemed to get along with them just fine. He also didn't share any grief about them leaving, nor details of how that happened, as the various transitions between peoples. The just judgment section was quite befuddling. The judgments he mentioned, some of them seemed biased, so I questioned the word just being used to describe them. It felt wrong to me that a man who spoke of people with no personal judgment then used personal judgment to describe some passages on just judgment. Now, the history portion of these judgments does jive with the history I got out of my meditations, so that is not my issue here. I think it was the without fault line and the dear God gave it lines. I think the word judgment in this section is being used as the word discernment should be rather than judgment. Knowing what is right and wrong, as opposed to judging others for violating or agreeing with your moral code. To give backstory on that, he said that somebody gave judgment without fault, right? So he's putting in his own personal input there. And then in the next stanza, because it's written in poetic format, he said it was God himself that gave that judgment, even though it was a person in the story that gave the judgment. So he is putting his personal thought onto who the person who did the judging was, right? So where the previous portion of the history and who was there didn't feel to have any personal inputs, it just felt like fact, 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 fact. In this stanza on the judgment, he was putting in, you could feel that he was putting in opinion as opposed to what happened. The conversation with the giant was rather interesting, and the only part of the story I remembered from the first reading of this book. I thought his take on history strange upon first reading, because again, this is the second time I read the book. Now I know the truth of his story and can expand on it a bit more, which I don't here. I don't know when the giants vanished from our realm, but interactions with them in lore always intrigues me. I was also intrigued, as before, that the story says Ireland was partitioned, where the question at hand is Terra. Then I put in here, which means land, but Ireland has many islands, so it's hard to say what they're referring to when they mention Terra, which they say in the story is a big hill, right? So are they saying Ireland as a nation? Right? They're using it interchangeably in the story. And it doesn't sound like that at first, but by the time you get to the end of it, they're using it interchangeably. In this story, knowledge is in the west, battle to the north, prosperity to the east, music to the south. Kingship resides in the center. I really like this section because it breaks down the directions in interesting fashion. The story explains the origin of the ancient trees which have perished, and that is the giant is carrying a branch that sustains him, that feeds him, and he gave seeds from the fruit from that branch to Fintan. And then Fintan went around and planted all those ancient trees, and then the ancient trees died before Fintan did. Okay, so Fintan outlived them. In this portion, he also explained the partitions are as they always have been and always will be, per what the giants has told him, and the people that were alive at the time, because the giant wanted to meet all the people. I found it interesting that Fintan said, "Let it be as we found it," and that the giant decreed it and was either the giant said, or he said that the giant was either an angel of God or God himself, which I find that interesting. You know, it was written after Christianity came, so of course there's a Christian spin to it. There's a Christian spin to every Irish tale. On page 65, he says his father was a descendant of Noah, yet Fintan himself was at least 50 years old when the flood he lived through happened. He had been alive 5,500 years at the time the story was regaled. Okay, so if he was a descendant of Noah at the age that he said he was, and the line of Noah back as far as he said it was, that would put Noah being alive during the days of Atlantis. Right. It's very interesting, huh? As for the prompt of this essay, what basic orientation to life is necessary for you to cultivate balance? From the way Fenton told his story of history, he mostly told it from the viewpoint of an observer. There were a few places he included his own opinion. He did take seeds and planted them in places which I would love to look up and see if there's a pattern there, in terms of like on a map, and put dots where they all were. I'm sure there is. In fact, I'm thinking there's some kind of a sacred geometry symbol to where he put the trees. The only impact he truly had was that of a sage who shared the stories of history he observed, which influenced the decisions of those he regaled his knowledge and wisdom to. I have a lot of questions, which I guess is not a surprise. At no point did it describe in what manner were his observations, nor if he was doing anything but observing, or simply talking to passers-by as a friend to gain as much information as he could. He held positions of power in some of the civilizations. He mentioned such as the one where he took a wife, which is way when he was young. 5,500 years, yeah, pick a time to be young. Especially when he was under the water, he said, for 100 years. And I think Ireland was a desert for either 100 or 1,000 years after that. So, was he always in a position of power? From my understanding, I would say he demonstrated the ability to look at events and people from different perspectives, from that of the observer. In doing so, he was able to enhance his wisdom to better make choices in what would be the best for nature and society as a whole. Stop. For example, in my Discord feed today, many people see a world full of crime and are afraid to walk out their front door for fear of being the next victim of some senseless violence. I can understand that perspective because that is what they see and what the news tells them is happening. Another perspective is, in order to end the violence and crimes against humanity and nature, we must first know who the perpetrators are. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we are better able to figure out solutions when we have no choice but to acknowledge these things are happening. We can then come together as a society and heal what ails us. One of the most important bits of wisdom I have seen recently, and I can't remember who said it or what the exact words are, but you can't fix a problem from the same angle or level that caused it. You must see it from a different angle or higher up. I think that's what Fenton was describing in his stories. Talking to so many people from so many walks of life can expand your way of thinking, that seeing different perspectives becomes easier. And even if you just listen to the stories of others, you can become wiser for the listening. And that's how I ended it. I don't know if it answers their prompt or not, but I couldn't think of anything else I should add to the prompt based on what's in the story. So, because for me, balance includes nature, and there wasn't much nature in the story. There was a lot of history, but it was history of the people, not history of the land. The only thing that was history of the land is leave the land alone, right? There's nothing about tending the land. There's nothing about nurturing the land, nothing about maintaining the history of the land and the way it had been kept. The story wasn't balanced. Balance among human society, maybe, but human society isn't the only thing that requires balance on this planet. So, I don't know. We'll see what they say about my my commentary. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.